Hi everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities, challenging norms. My name's Dr. Stephen Burrell, and I'm here with Sandy Ruxton. How are things at your end, Sandy?
Hi Stephen, I see you've mentioned our new tagline for the podcast there, which goes along with a new trailer. Now, I suspect listeners may not remember the original tagline, they may not even have heard it in the first place, but it was Current Conversations About Men's Lives. And given we've just been writing a book chapter on podcasting and activism, we thought maybe we should have a description that is a bit more action orientated. That's the thinking anyway, so we'd be interested to see how you like it. So how are you doing, Stephen?
Yeah, and hopefully as well the tagline kind of reflects how the podcast is kind of simultaneously interested in how ideas about masculinity are changing in contemporary society, but also the kind of role we can each play in opening up what it means to be a man and kind of questioning rigid, restrictive gender norms, which all fits very well with the themes of our conversation today. But yes, I'm well, thanks Sandy, and very pleased to have with us Professor Brendan Gough. So Brendan is a critical social psychologist and a qualitative researcher based at Leeds Beckett University in the UK. And he's published a wealth of research over multiple decades on men and masculinities, especially in relation to health, lifestyle and well-being.
Yes, and most recently Brendan edited the Palgrave Handbook of Critical Social Psychology. But today we're going to be focusing with him on his earlier book, Contemporary Masculinities, Embodiment, Emotion and Wellbeing, which brings together many of his areas of interest. So, hi Brendan, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, lovely to be here.
To start off with, a recurring focus of your research has been how men, especially those who are heterosexual I think, are engaging with conventionally feminised practices, so weight loss, infertility, grooming and so on, in order to explore how contemporary masculinity is being constructed. So what got you interested in this area of research and in looking at men and masculinities in particular?
It's a bit of a long story. When I was a student a long time ago, I did a mainstream psychology degree, and in my final year there was an option called Women and Psychology, and it was the first time I was really exposed to interesting critical takes on gender from feminist and interdisciplinary perspectives. And it just really engaged me. It might have not just the content, but we had a series of guest lecturers come in from different academic backgrounds in different sectors. And it just kind of lit a spark for me. Although it was a while before that led to any of my own research practice on masculinity, because I then did a PhD. This is at Queen's in Belfast, in my hometown, and there was a PhD program in social psychology at the time, really focused on the conflict. So I started off looking at intergroup relations in the north of Ireland. Went in a different direction. Ended up doing something on, I was a bit pretentious then, on postmodernism. And then I actually got my first job in England, in Sheffield, in the mid-90s, and started lecturing in social psychology. And we covered gender issues. And most of the textbook material on gender was focused on women and femininity. And I thought, well, what about the other stuff? Where is it? So I started casting my net widely, and at that time, actually, in social psychology in the UK, Margie Wetherill and Nigel Edley were starting to publish on masculinity, and I found that work really inspiring. And then I looked beyond psychology to the critical studies of men and masculinities, and started to incorporate that material into my teaching. And the students engaged with it, actually. It was kind of a bit novel, distinctive for them. And it then encouraged me to try out some research in that field. And so I started a focus group data collection with male university students, broadly focused on what it means to be a man today. And that's how it all started.
No, very interesting. And that reflects some of the work that we've done, Stephen, doesn't it? On the backgrounds of men who get into this work, and those in our case who are interested in tackling violence against women. Very often it was a sort of university spark that started them off, and it was a course of some kind. So what you said actually does chime with that. But I wanted to ask you a bit more about your research, and that's been conducted by analysing what men are saying in online spaces recently. I think that's a particular area of interest. But when it comes to the virtual world, our focus tends to be on the harms experienced and perpetrated within it for understandable reasons. But your research highlights that when it comes to digital masculinities, the internet also creates, should we say, positive opportunities for men to do masculinity in more expansive ways. So do you want to say a bit more about that? Why is that the case, and what advantages do spaces like online community forums offer men in this regard?
Yeah, sure. I mean, traditionally, of course, men are discouraged from being open about their emotions and their vulnerabilities. And what we've found, for example, looking at men's experiences of infertility, we find really good examples of forum spaces where men are opening up and receiving support and giving support and feeling recognized. And of course, that's beneficial. So the whole notion of peer support has been very important for men going through particular struggles, and in this case, infertility. Now, what you find in the forums, actually, when you dig deep into it, is that most men who are on the forums don't actually post. They're just kind of lurking and looking at what's being said. And I guess what we don't have really are proper evaluations of how being a member of a forum of that nature actually impacts health and well-being. But we suspect it's a positive impact. And certainly we've come across really open accounts from men about their struggles and difficulties, in this case with infertility, because that's a particular journey which is so tricky for men and women to negotiate, whether it's a male factor issue or a female factor issue, or as is the case with many couples, it's not determined what the cause of the infertility is.
Is it something to do also with the anonymity of making connections online that makes it easier for men?
Yeah, that's what we find, and people have actually oriented to the anonymity explicitly, and they say that actually I wouldn't do this if I was exposed, or if you knew my name or whatever. So I think at least historically that has been important, but I guess now men's peer support also occurs offline, and you've got groups like, say, Andy's Man's Club around mental health issues, which encourage men to come to groups face to face. I think it's weekly. And that's a relatively recent phenomenon where you get in lots of men coming forward, actually in person, to discuss, their emotions and their struggles.
Well, I was just going to say, it does raise complexities, doesn't it? Because I guess we do often see social media and things as being very toxic for justifiable reasons, and countries like Australia are actually banning it for children and things. But your research shows, doesn't it, that it can provide really positive things as well. So that is a difficulty. On that topic, there is, of course, a lot of discussion at the moment about the impact of the kind of manosphere and far right politics and what effect that's having on young men. But your research does also show that in complex ways, ideas about masculinity are changing in different ways in society. And actually many boys and men are engaging in kind of acts of care, for other people and also for themselves. So you have research, for example, men engaging in different kinds of advocacy and allyship for other people, whether that's women or LGBTQ people, for example. So I guess, this is a big question, but at this moment in time, how optimistic do you feel about men's kind of engagement with gender equality, gender justice?
Yeah, it's a big question. I've had PhD students looking at this one way or another, and it's inconclusive and it's complicated, as you say. We've got different theories of masculinity, and I quite like hybrid masculinity as a concept because I think lots of men and boys are caught between traditional and contemporary notions of masculinity, between forms of masculinity which might, limit their expression and maybe contribute to, sexism and homophobia and so on. So on the one hand, on the other hand, we're more exposed to inclusive, caring forms of masculinity. And I guess what shapes men and their behaviours and kind of choices is partly to do with that kind of navigation of different notions of masculinity, which is also obviously informed by their biographies and backgrounds. So now one of my PhD students has recently completed, Lucy Eldred, and I'll give you a contemporary example from her data. Both the men and women she talked to, young men, young women, about the topic was contemporary masculinity and is it changing? So exactly what you're asking about. Some of the focus groups came to a scenario, a dating scenario. We have a male and female having dinner, and the question of who pays the bill, right? And the discussions were so back and forth and tortuous and, around the kind of subtleties and intricacies of what it means if the man pays or they go Dutch and they pay half each, or the woman pays, and they were going round in circles, and they never settled on one kind of perfect solution. And to me, that's like a microcosm of gender relations, between men and women. I guess it's essentially something that can't be settled completely, and that it's fluid and context-bound and informed by wider discourses and cultural expectations. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. No, and it chimes with research I've done as well. Yeah, and I love that kind of nuanced perspective of your work. That, it's easy to draw kind of quite scary conclusions, isn't it, when you see some opinion polls and what young men might express support for. But I suspect often those young men actually hold quite complex, contradictory views, don't they? So we should probably refrain from drawing too broad conclutions either way, really.
Well, I think that highlights the value of qualitative research.
Yes.
I'm an advocate for qualitative research, and and qualitative research comes in many shapes and sizes, and but you can get at the nuance and the complexity and the fluidity, by engaging with men and boys in safe spaces where they're comfortable and kind of feel that they can open up.
Yeah. From that, kind of moving on to perhaps a little bit more of the focus on your work on men's health. I guess one thing we've seen in recent decades in kind of neoliberal societies is an increasing focus on, I suppose, what people call healthism, in which kind of health and fitness are kind of really highly valued and prioritized and are seen as being within our kind of personal control, that we as individuals are responsibilized for kind of disciplining ourselves and our bodies to fit in with those social expectations, and perhaps judged if we're seen as failing to do that. And of course, a huge industry has grown out of that, which is increasingly targeting men as well as women. So how do those pressures around kind of healthism interact with contemporary ideas about masculinity, would you say?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of an overlap between healthism and associated ideas and some traditional masculinity ideals. So, conventionally men are expected to be self-reliant and rational and action-orientated, and, they get things done. And Healthism is similar in that regard. It kind of privileges kind of neoliberal, individualistic ethos where you're responsible for your own actions. And of course, it's a very denatured, denuded kind of theory or position around health and well-being, because completely ignores social determinants and social structures, which we know there's evidence that wider determinants have a big impact on health and well-being. So yeah, we have written about this before, and I think what's also unfortunate around men's health promotion in many cases is that those traditional norms, which are associated with poor health practices in the first place, are kind of informing men's health promotion campaigns. So it's a bit ironic. And, I guess it is difficult sometimes to hook men in to a campaign and to get their attention. Classically, for example, some men's health promotion campaigns use football language and metaphors, and often actually have health sessions or fitness sessions in football grounds or football facilities. Now that will appeal to some men, but not all men. So just need to be a bit wary of falling back on reductive stereotypes, I guess.
Yeah. So they're kind of perhaps inadvertently reinforcing some of the very stereotypes which might actually be part of the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
Have you come across any examples, any positive examples of kind of public health interventions which have perhaps challenged some of these kind of rigid gender expectations for men?
I think there are lots of good practices around men's health interventions today. I mean, the classic one, which a lot of the public will know about, is men's sheds, and that's traditionally where older, often isolated men are brought together in a community space. And it's not generally advertised as a health or a mental health initiative. And they might get together and do woodwork or carpentry or some other activity and learn new skills. But in that process, they're kind of bonding with each other, shoulder to shoulder rather than face to face. And over time, they start to relax, feel comfortable, and maybe open up a little bit and start to socialize outside the main group. And so that's a nice model, which I think has been evaluated and, is quite successful in many different countries.
I think it's an interesting example as well, isn't it? In the sense that, it does to an extent rely on a traditional stereotype too of men being interested in DIY and we get them in that way and then do things with them, and I mean, I was thinking, well, for someone like me, I don't want to go to someone like that, I'd be more interested maybe in going to, mainstream daycare provision, but then there's a lot of men who see that as more sort of feminized service, which is not for them. So there's some interesting dilemmas in there, aren't there, about, targeted services at men or services which are more generalized, if you like.
Yeah, I really take that point. I mean, I haven't looked at all men's sheds or anything, but there must be some examples where they have a greater range of activity and they don't rely solely on the classic examples of male labour or leisure interests.
Yeah. Well, I suppose conversely, there may be an issue where some women would be interested in DIY, and where do they get that,
I mean, I was part of a project when I was in Nottingham, looking at older men and weight management, and I think it was sponsored by Notts County Football Club, and it was called Motivate, and it did attract a lot of men, but it did attract some women as well. And it's kind of interesting that I guess it shows the limits of a gender-only focus when it comes to men's health promotion. If you need to take a more kind of nuanced view and maybe more intersectional view, because what works for middle class men might not work for working class men, and so on.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you in a related area about the UK government's first ever men's health strategy for England. I think you're a member of the newly established Men's Health Academic Network. What do you make of those developments, and what do you see as some of the sort of positives and risks associated with policy making in this area?
Well, I didn't know what to expect when they asked me to become involved, but I have been pleasantly surprised. For a start, the network that they've gathered together is quite diverse. It's not just medics or people interested in health. We've got people like me and other social scientists on the group, chaired by Paul Galdas at York, who's, got a good reputation in this area and is kind of got a foot in the health camp, but also in the gender camp as well. So I've been encouraged by what they've done so far. So we all kind of input into the strategy itself, which was published in December, I think, recently. And now we're focused on implementation and evaluation. So time will tell. I mean, I don't think there's much additional resource going in to supporting men's health programs. I mean, I think they've got some flagship initiatives, for example, with the Premier League and mental health. So that's great. But I think hopefully going forward, we'll see things like, the National Institute of Health Research promoting more research in particular areas of men's health. So that will lead to greater awareness. It'll lead to, for example, evaluating existing men's health programs. I think that'll be a part of what they might fund going forward. And that evidence will then help in establishing and improving services going forward.
And how are they treating the sort of relationship between men's health and women's health in this? Because clearly, these issues are entwined, and there are issues of power relations in there too.
Absolutely.
Or are they just separate strategies which have nothing, to do with each other? Which would
I know what you mean. Again, I was encouraged by their attitude and position in this regard, because they're not saying men's and women's health is oppositional, or that it's a competition for funding. They're saying, for example, they're saying men's health. If we support men to live better lives, that would benefit men, obviously, but also their significant others, their families and friends. If you take an obvious example like suicide prevention, the more men's lives we can save, the better that is for them, obviously, but also their partners and their children and their relations and friends. So, and conversely, supporting women's health can have benefits for men as well.
And I think I heard you say a minute ago that you were impressed by the focus on diversity amongst men.
Yeah, they explicitly reference intersectionality in the strategy, which is very positive. There is an awareness that there are particular groups that are vulnerable in certain areas. For example, if you take prostate cancer, we know that ethnic minority men, especially from Caribbean heritage, are more at risk from developing prostate cancer. So it's right that resources should focus on that group to improve outcomes. So, they've got a clear idea of particular health areas where the need is, and that sometimes relates to different social identities and positions. So, it's quite nice to see that. They also take a life course perspective as well, again, which is important, because we know that at different stages in the lives of boys and men, there are different pressures and transitions and events which might have a particular influence on their health and well-being. So that was great.
So moving on, Brendan, one area of focus for you has been on men's struggles with body image. And of course, most research in this area has been conducted with women. But actually, increasing numbers of men are expressing worries about and dissatisfaction with their bodies as well, and engaging in a kind of variety of practices to try and kind of mitigate those concerns. So what would you say is driving this increase in worry among men about their bodies? And in what ways are men's kind of body projects, as you call them, kind of similar and different to those of women?
Yeah, so I mean, again, that's another big question, but you know, if you look at social and cultural change in the last 40 years or so, we live in an increasingly visual culture. There are more commercial and marketing pressures which position men as consumers of a range of health and beauty products and services in a way that didn't happen for my dad's generation, for example. Now, there were always some expectations and pressures for men to look good. You know, my dad was a teddy boy in the 60s, and there's a certain image and kind of care of appearance that comes into play there. But I think what's different in recent decades is that it's so commercialized. Now we've got social media. I think the latest trend for men is looks maxing. I mean, don't ask me about that. I'm not totally sure what it is. But it's, you know, it's another iteration of intense and demanding expectations of men and boys to look a particular way. Now, of course, the classic ideal is lean and muscular, and you see that, you know, traditionally in the front pages of magazines and billboards and so on. But in our research, we've dug a little bit deeper, and you know, with interviews and focus groups with young men, for example, and we find that it's not just, you know, body fat and muscularity that they're concerned with. They're concerned with maybe going bald, you know, or, you know, losing their hair when they're young. And you know, we had one example of a guy who thought he had a receding hairline, and he wanted his hair a particular way, and his hair straighteners were broken, and he wouldn't leave the house until his new kind of hair straighteners arrived. And we got stories from men about, you know, who feel that they're shorter than average, and you know, so height can be a source of anxiety and dissatisfaction for boys and men. So there are all sorts of potential issues, not just the classically advertised ones, that men kind of reveal, you know, in qualitative research. So, yeah, I think it's more pronounced these days with social media. We've also found that young men in particular might be susceptible to taking various substances to make them appear leaner or more muscular. I mean, we wrote about ephedrine, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, which can have long-term health consequences, and yet young men might be taking it so they look leaner, and you know, that gives them a certain status. Another one we looked at was synthol, which is an oil which you inject directly into your muscle to make them look bigger. So we know that boys and young men are doing this. It's not clear what the prevalence is because it's so hard to determine, but obviously that is a cause for alarm when we know that these kind of substances will have health consequences down the line. So,
you mentioned in your book, I think, that there's quite an element of pain in certainly in the injection of those substances, and that, you know, there's something about having to go through the pain barrier, you know, connecting with notions of masculinity.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's part of gym and fitness culture generally. You know, no pain, no gain, and or sport, where there are lots of examples of men getting injured and playing on and not coming off until they're forced off. So yeah, it ties into classic notions of masculinity, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I guess on the one hand, you could say, well, this is men embracing more traditionally feminized practices, to do with looking after your appearance. But then on the other hand, so much of it does still seem to be about, well, things like being muscular, right? Being strong, being tough. And as you said, even the processes themselves potentially being quite painful. And I think your research has shown that, hasn't it? About some of the interesting ways that men might rationalize or explain some of the different practices they might engage in.
Yeah, I mean, one of the research projects I enjoyed most was with a PhD student, Matthew Hall, who looked at metrosexuality. This was when I was at Nottingham about 15 years ago. So one of his studies looked at a young man given a YouTube tutorial about how men should wear makeup. And we analysed that tutorial and the responses. And it was just fascinating data because what we found was that men didn't talk about makeup in terms of aesthetics. They talked of makeup use as something practical, as something which, some Australian guys were saying that wearing certain makeup protects them from the elements or the harsh winters. Some other rationales were to do with success with women. It makes me look better and, women are more attracted to me. Or it's good to have a certain type of appearance at work. So what we found basically was that young men were connecting makeup use to heterosexual masculine norms. It makes me more attractive to women, more successful at work. It kind of protects me from the elements, and amid all that discourse, what we also found was that they were kind of trying to distance themselves from associations with femininity or being gay. And the classic quote from that study was, "I'm metro, not gay." So, yeah, lots to go at there. I mean, the data were fascinating.
Yeah. And you mentioned issues around hair and grooming. I think that's fascinating because, when I was growing up, and it was mainly in the 1960s, 70s, having long hair was a statement of rebellion, really, and it was seen in a sort of political sense.
That's right.
And there was none of this issue about, how you look, or not so much anyway. It was very much, your school wants you to have a hair at this length. Well, I'm going to try and grow it longer, So it was a very different time, and it just shows how much notions have changed over time.
Absolutely.
It's relatively recent, isn't it?
Well, even if you think
isn't it?
Back to the 1980s and the New Romantics, that was another kind of phase where men felt emboldened to experiment with makeup and bouffant hairstyles and be adventurous around fashion and so on. So, yeah, you get these cyclical examples, and going back historically as well to the dandies and so on. But I guess the difference today is that it's more kind of commercially driven, marketing a whole range of services and products, almost aggressively, positioning men as active consumers and needing certain products and services to be a normal member of society.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, when I was growing up, none of these products really. There was soap, there was shampoo,
exactly,
and there was shaving, and that was basically it. And then the bathroom with my son in it had all these different products appearing, which I was amazed by. I said, "Oh yes, I need this, I need that."
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because if you look in the supermarket, the amount of products aimed at men are still quite small compared to those aimed at women. But nonetheless, I think the point is very salient, isn't it? And I was thinking as well about what you were saying earlier, Brendan, about like social determinants of health and the kind of pressure an expectation on all of us, I guess, right, to be kind of thin or to be lean, and but obviously in reality it's very hard for people to actually live up to that for all sorts of different reasons. Could you say a bit more about that, about what effects that kind of pressure is having on men, like for example rise in eating disorders and things like that among men as well?
I guess it contributes to everyday anxieties, and these kind of expectations and pressures drive men towards certain practices. We've already talked about, taking different substances. I mean, if you think about today, lots of protein drinks and energy drinks, where the health claims are probably dubious at best. I guess everyday consumption, everyday lifestyle practices have become oriented to, aesthetic health, if you like. I quite like that term because these days it's not just important to be healthy, but you need to look healthy according to certain norms and standards. So, yeah, you mentioned eating disorders, a classically feminized arena. Although it is encouraging these days that there's a bit more openness about men and eating disorders and dedicated websites and services, and kind of men sharing their stories online, for example. So all sorts of potential consequences for men and boys relating to commercialized, kind of consumerized pressures and expectations.
Makes me think as well, the rapid rise in kind of weight loss jabs and things, which I think are quite popular among men as well, aren't they? And one thing I remember from your book was perhaps men might be less willing to admit to body dissatisfaction than women. Yeah, so I guess lots of men are perhaps struggling with this alone as well.
I wanted to just move on to asking you a bit about men's experience of infertility, which is something which perhaps remains rather under-discussed in society. It's often seen as a women's problem, but I think it's estimated that it affects around 1 in 6 couples in the UK and maybe 5 to 10% of men. So what kind of impacts does your research show that infertility has on men's lives? And what are some of the ways that they attempt to deal with this?
So yeah, we've had this research program in infertility for about 12, 13 years, and it's been led by my colleague Esme Hanna, who's now at De Montfort University. She's a sociologist, and we basically collaborate well together, and it's worked really well. And when we started the research, there wasn't that much published on men's experiences or accounts of infertility. As you said, Sandy, it's been treated as a kind of feminized domain, not just in research, but in healthcare practice as well, and men are kind of on the margins. Even if it's a male factor problem, ironically, it's the woman who's addressed as the key agent often. So, we've collected data through qualitative surveys, focus groups, interviews, and what we find, one phrase that sticks out is an emotional roller coaster, right? We've also got online forum data with men going through infertility. And highs and lows, often a feeling of emasculation, or at least masculinity being threatened, and a real sensitivity around other people who have children. If you're struggling with infertility, it becomes difficult and awkward to retain the same relations with friends and family who are procreating, right? And that was a big issue that came up for a lot of men. And then we also find that men are increasingly targeted by companies online concerning products and services which allegedly boost male fertility. So all these vitamins and supplements, and I guess ironically for the first time, men are being positioned, maybe not as equal partners in the infertility space, but certainly partners with agency. And they're being constructed as one half of the equation who can make a difference to fertility chances if they do X, Y, Z. Vitamins, supplements, certain diets, cutting down or cutting out alcohol. And even though the evidence is very flimsy and mixed around what causes infertility, whether male or female, and what can help boost fertility. You can imagine that lots of these men feel so pressurized to try anything. And of course, a lot of these products and services can be expensive as well, and that adds another dimension of pressure. So it's almost like a vicious circle. And these poor guys are trying everything, and obviously, the relationship with their partners can be fraught as well. I mean, they're already in a difficult situation, but there might be differential expectations on, who's doing what to boost fertility chances, and maybe someone's perceived as not doing enough, or all those things come into play. So what we found is that men going through infertility, there's so many dimensions to that experience around relationships, finances, pressure on masculinity, pressure to pursue lifestyle changes and accommodations which might make a difference. And it's so fraught for a lot of men, actually.
Right. And is male infertility, addressed within the men's health strategy? Is that part of what's being discussed, or?
Good question. I'll have to check, Sandy, but I don't think it's mentioned explicitly. You can imagine that certain headline conditions would take prominence. A big one for men is cardiovascular health, for example, and obviously things like prostate cancer, testicular cancer. So I think that's maybe down the list a bit, but I would like to see more work in that area as well. I mean, I think for starters, we need better, medical evidence around causes and solutions, because the literature, the evidence base is so low.
It makes me think of something which is often found in research about, that perhaps we as men might see our bodies like machines, and I can relate to this as well, and then when it malfunctions, you kind of hope you can just easily fix it, but obviously it's often much more complicated than that, isn't it? And there aren't necessarily easy fixes, or maybe it does go beyond us as individuals. Our consumption practices can't necessarily fix this, which then obviously brings up all sorts of emotional struggles as well.
Absolutely. I mean, that machine metaphor is kind of embedded, isn't it, in the culture, and across all areas of men's health and well-being. And the kind of stereotype is that men take a very functional approach to health, and what hasn't been covered so much in men's health promotion is kind of the messy underbelly of emotions and anxieties.
Another area that you've conducted research on is men's experiences of depression as well. And I guess in that research, and I think across all of your research, really, you've shown that, men clearly do experience a wide range of deep feelings. And actually, as you said, they will express those if they feel able to do so. So could you perhaps explain a bit more about that? Like, what is it that you think does help men, beyond what we've already discussed, to actually articulate what they're going through when it comes to something like depression? And how does that expression of emotion as well, how does that interact with some of these expectations around masculinity?
Yeah, it's interesting that we've done some analysis of men talking to each other in forums about mental health as well. And what was really intriguing, for example, in one study, was that men had to present themselves initially as having tried to sort it out themselves first, in order to garner some respect in the community, in order to have the status as a member of that community to be listened to and taken seriously. So again, those masculinity factors come into play. But having said that, lots of evidence of peer support in some online spaces. And one interesting issue is around medication, because sometimes that is seen as giving in for men. They can't control it themselves, and that's often why when men talk about their medication, they often give a backstory where they've tried other things themselves, so that they can't be blamed for being passive or out of control. Another recent study was with men struggling with anxiety, because in the men's mental health literature, depression tends to take center place. And I think anxiety might be something which is more feminized, actually. And maybe that's why there hasn't been that much attention on it. But of course, men do suffer from anxiety, and with the men who had anxiety-related diagnoses and men who hadn't. But you're talking about more mundane anxieties, everyday anxieties. And again, the men opened up for us, and we've got lots of examples of everyday anxieties. Many of which we've touched on already, like around body image and so on. I think, again, more generally, the culture has opened up, and there's now more visibility around the mental health of men and boys, and lots of different initiatives, lots of celebrities telling their own stories, and kind of role modeling for different communities. And, I think that's been very positive. I guess, like I said before, what we need to move on to now is to really identify those interventions that work best for particular communities, through more research and evaluation.
You use the concept of masculine capital as well, don't you, about how that can help men perhaps feel more able to disclose something like that. Do you want to just explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I borrowed that from Bourdieu, from sociology. And I think it works because I think often for men to venture into a new, traditionally feminized arena, like help seeking, for example, they almost have to establish themselves as traditionally manly to start with. And that gives them the capital to withstand any potential criticism, or even to avoid criticism and censure. So if you talk about young men, if you're the captain of the rugby team and you're all on a night out, and you say you don't want to drink alcohol, normally that would be frowned upon. But because of that masculinity capital bestowed by that rugby captain position, then you can be immune from that type of criticism, and you can make that healthy choice with very little problem. So that's just a kind of very crude example, but I guess it relates back to hybrid masculinity, because I think it's often those men who are already privileged who can appropriate more feminized or minoritized forms of masculinity. And what we need to work on then more closely is empowering boys and men from disadvantaged backgrounds, or where the scope for maneuvering around masculinity is very limited. We need to kind of support them with resources and interventions.
Something you've already mentioned is the importance of peer support, and the difference that can make in helping people who are dealing with issues like depression, or indeed any of the issues we've mentioned today. So perhaps, as important as it is that we encourage men to ask for help, perhaps we also need to be doing more to encourage men to, to be asking each other if they need help, I suppose. So what would you say makes a positive difference in that regard? And what would you say is perhaps less helpful? And how do you think we can foster more of that kind of emotional openness among us as men or boys?
I think what we found in some of our research is that the people who men open up to, if they do open up at all, is to other women in their lives. It could be mothers, sisters, girlfriends, and so on. And with kind of self-disclosure with other men, it tends to be a bit more indirect, or context-based, or a bit kind of stilted. But what's encouraging, as we've mentioned already, is that there are more opportunities and more groups springing up where men are encouraged to come forward and talk to each other directly, face to face, or even just come and listen to other men's stories, and then maybe have the confidence eventually to tell your own story. So I think that's a positive new phase, because with relying on women as confidants. It almost positions women as responsible for men's health and well-being, and we want to move away from that, so that men feel comfortable taking responsibility for their own emotions and their own mental health, and also seeking help from other men as well as women.
I wanted to just ask you a last thing, which was how you're developing your work on men and masculinities. Have you got new projects you're working on now that you wanted to leave us with?
I still work with PhD students and dissertation students, and a recent project was on the Manosphere, actually, and I've been trying to write this paper with a student, looking at more mainstream influencers, not the kind of extreme examples, the Andrew Tates, but more kind of middle of the road podcasters, and how they, in a way, it's more important to look at these guys because they're attracting audiences of young men, and initially it looks like a positive space for mental health promotion and so on, but it's almost like a backdoor route to radicalization often, and so it can be a bit insidious. And so we're looking at the mechanisms of recruiting young men to ostensibly innocent or positive spaces, and how they might get roped into reproducing regressive and retrograde gender notions. And so I'm it's quite a theoretically sophisticated one, but I just I want to get it right, and I'm hoping to have that done by Easter in some shape or form. And then I think I'm generally more interested in young masculinities and the pressures and expectations, and there are groups like Beyond Equality go into schools and kind of try and workshop masculinities and in a healthy direction, and I really like what they do, and I'd like to work in that space a bit more.
Well, thank you. That sounds fascinating what you're doing, and thanks for everything that you discussed today. You opened up large areas of territory which we haven't discussed on the podcast before. So thank you very much for doing that, and thanks for doing your work. It sounds very, very interesting.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brendan. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Stephen, there were so many interesting issues that Brendan raised there. Were the things that you felt touched you personally in what he had to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So many things, as you said. I mean, I think we can all relate to this, can't we? Like, we all feel these anxieties and concerns about our health and well-being, and the pressures to make our body fit in with social norms and expectations. And I think that the difficulty, as like Brendan showed, that there have been, he traced these social shifts that we are starting to talk about some of these things more, but still like so much fear among men about being vulnerable, and opening up about that with others. I mean, so one thing I can relate to is in recent times I have been diagnosed with a mild form of Crohn's disease, which is like a form of irritable bowel disease, and it's just been like quite an interesting experience for me because, to be honest, I've never really had any serious health issues, so I'm incredibly lucky in that regard. And so I think I probably have approached my health in quite a masculine way about seeing my body like a machine and all these things. So it's been quite chastening for me to have that realization, that we are all frail, we are all vulnerable, and our bodies, they're not machines and they're not perfect, and we all will at various times in our lives have struggles that we'll need help with, and we need to reach out to others. And but it's just incredibly scary, isn't it? It's very difficult to open up to that, and you can see why lots of people do put off going to see the doctor and things. But ironically, because we're very afraid, isn't it, of actually of acknowledging our frailty and our the fact that our bodies, that this will happen to them.
I wasn't going to mention this, but I think I probably will now. I had kidney disease, and I had to have part of a kidney removed. So I was in hospital, actually Great Ormond Street Hospital, so a really renowned children's hospital because of that. And, some of my interest around this issue, I think, comes from that experience, if I'm totally honest. Wow. Because, of course, I was surrounded by, women who were caring. I mean, of course, there were surgeons who were all male at that stage, and doctors largely male. but all the nurses who were doing the day-to-day care were women. So I think that's significant for me.
Yeah.
But anyway, moving on from that, I thought so many of the issues were fascinating, and I wanted to pick up on the infertility issue, because that seems highly important and very, very moving, the way that Brendan talked about it as well. There are guys who are suffering because of this, and probably some of them undiagnosed, unnoticed, and from what I've read, quite a lot of male infertility, about 40%, is related to a sort of dilated vein in the scrotum, which can be addressed through surgery, but often men are not aware of it. But then you get into also all the sort of lifestyle issues that he was talking about, and I mean, amusingly, we were approached as a podcast by somebody who wants to come on and talk about a particular type of underpants that they produce, which keep the testicles cooler, and they were saying that this means that the sperm is not damaged. I mean, I have no insight into whether this is true or not, but it does show you how the sort of lifestyle factors and consumption are very much a part of this whole discussion now, and you could look at other areas as well. And you see quite a lot of adverts these days for particular kinds of underpants for incontinence. For men, I mean, that's quite a big issue too, particularly for older men. And it is increasingly discussed, but still a bit under the radar. Anyway, sorry, I've whittled on there, but
no. Well, but it shows as well, doesn't it? I suppose that capitalism is also, that's part of it, isn't it? About trying to make money out of these things, about almost exploiting our anxieties and insecurities about all of these things, because obviously lots of men do feel this pressure, right, that we should be able to perform, that our bodies should be perfect, and that certainly sexually, that we should be able to perform in that way, and that everything should be functioning very well, and that something like infertility is somehow very emasculating, because men are just assumed to be, very reproductively effective, and if you're not, then somehow you're a failure of a man, and so all these kind of products, associated with that, or associated with things like, having a large penis as well, and all these kinds of things. All of these pressures about our bodies are causing a great deal of stress and anxiety, aren't they? And people being bullied as well about things like their bodies.
I was interested in what he had to say about peer support as well. It made me think of the episode that we did some time ago with Shay Franklin, also in Ireland, but South. And he was talking about groups he runs with older men, and one of the activities they do is to basically get out all the pills that they're taking currently and put them on the table, and then talk about what they're taking, why they're taking them, how they make them feel, and he said it's quite enlightening and fascinating, but also quite moving, to find out what's going on for people, really, and it's a sort of way into doing that.
There's also there's two other things which come to my mind as well here, one of which is that I suppose kind of something you were alluding to about like which issues do get into the limelight and which don't, and that maybe it is starting to be more okay to talk about certain health issues like prostate cancer, which is obviously really important, but what about some of those other health issues which aren't seen as very kind of, I don't know, glamorous, like bowel disease and so on and so forth, parts of the body which we're particularly uncomfortable about, or issues which are seen as even less masculine, like Brendan talked about anxiety disorder, right, as opposed to depression, for example.
And also related to that, I think I did mention this during our conversation, how men's health practices are often, very entwined with their own and with women's positions in society, and there is a risk that you end up with a men's health strategy which goes down a completely separate track from a women's health strategy, whereas actually the interrelationship between the two is really important also, and the prominence of power issues in there as well.
Absolutely.
A lot of women's health issues are to do with men's violence, if you're honest about it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I mean also the thinking about things like the Manosphere, ironically, and kind of anti-feminist voices, claiming to speak on behalf of men, but actually sometimes making men's health problems worse, because there's a lot of pressure about men looking a certain way, being muscular, being strong, being fit, being attractive. So actually, the manosphere making those insecurities worse for men, ironically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why, an analysis like what we've heard from Brendan today is so important, really.
Yes.
Because actually he's taking a sort of pro-feminist lens and really applying that to some of the, issues that are troubling men that are very much focused on by men's rights activists. So I think it's very important what he's doing.
Absolutely, and showing that kind of complexity, that in some ways there's progress, but in some ways there's also still these very influential gender norms.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should wrap up for today, Stephen. I must go and brush my hair and
groom yourself a little bit more.
Groom myself a little bit more and say goodbye to all the listeners and see you next time.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Sandy. Take care of yourself, and listeners, do take care of yourselves as well. And we'll be back with another episode soon. And contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments. And please do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.